welcome to my presentation today. My name's Cameron. So today I'm going to be talking about a principle found in a book by Malcolm Gladwell called David and Goliath. And the principle of this is that your weaknesses are your strengths. This might seem a little counterintuitive. Your weaknesses are your strengths. Those are antonyms, obviously. But I think that by the time I'm done this presentation, you guys are going to see how the things that we oftentimes think are our greatest weaknesses in our lives actually turn out to be the thing that put us above the rest. So we all know the story of David and Goliath from the Bible, but just a quick recap. So the battle is won miraculously by an underdog who, by all expectation, should not have won. This is the way we've been told the story for many centuries. And it's why we say the phrase, David and Goliath, is embedded in our language as a metaphor for an improbable win. And the problem with that version of events, though, is that practically all of it is wrong. So, this is where the Battle of David and Goliath took place, the Valley of Ahel, Israel. So, just to kind of set the scene of what this battle was like, the Philistines set up camp on the southern ridge of Elha, and the Israelites pitched their tents on the other side. So it left the two armies looking across a ravine. And neither of them wanted to move. They didn't want to just come at each other. They knew there'd be a ton of loss of life. Neither of them wanted that. So they decided that they were just going to each send their best guy down. Those two would fight, and whoever won out of those two would be the winner to prevent the loss of life. So the Philistines sent down their greatest warrior, who was Goliath. We've all heard this before. So Goliath was 6'9". He had a javelin, spear, sword, and he had a large shield that actually someone else was carrying for him. He had a helmet, he had full body armor, and he shouted to the Israelites, "Choose a man and let him come to me." So all of the stuff that he's wearing is super, super heavy. It makes it hard to move. This is designed for one-on-one combat. So David wasn't a warrior. He actually was just bringing food down to his army. He was a teenager, he was young, and he was a shepherd. He worked with animals, sheep, and that's really important for what's going to happen. So in ancient armies, they did war a little bit differently than how we do war these days. So they had cavalry on horses. So these are guys, they're riding around on horses, they're hitting the other guys on horses with swords. And then there was infantry foot soldiers who had armor and swords and shields. So that's what Goliath was. He was one of these guys. He fought hand to hand. He wasn't up on a horse, and he wore heavy, heavy armor. He had a huge shield. He had a sword, and he was prepared to fight 1 versus 1 up close. And then there was slingers. So this is something that's pretty interesting they had back then. They had slings, and everybody's heard this part of the story of David and Goliath, of having a slingshot. All he had was a slingshot. And we often think of the slingshot as something that wasn't very worthwhile. But that's not what slingers were. Because back then, they had a literal leather pouch with strings on two sides, kind of like a slingshot now. And they put a lead ball or a rock, something heavy and dense, and then they would swing it around. So they'd swing it as fast as they could. And they would get this thing rotating super fast. So by the time you released it, it was going at an incredible speed. And so when you think about a gun, what makes the gun powerful isn't the little bullet. The bullet's tiny. If you threw a bullet at someone, it wouldn't do anything to them. What makes the bullet powerful is how fast the gun is launching it. And that's the same thing with these slingers. What made these deadly wasn't that they were just throwing rocks at them. It's that it was going so quickly that when it would hit them, it would be like shooting someone, literally, and it would go through their body because it was going so fast. If you didn't know how to do this, it would be nothing, right? Which is why today, when we hear the story, we think of the slingshot as nothing, because most of us, with a slingshot, it wouldn't be anything. But to them, it was a lot more. So Goliath was heavy infantry. He thinks he's going to be engaged in duel with another infantryman. When he says, "Come to me, that I may give your flesh to the birds of the heavens and beasts," the key phrase is "come to me." He needed David to come really close to him. And we're about to figure that out in a second. David had no intention of doing this. He was going to fight David the same way that he, as a shepherd, kept wild animals from eating his sheep. He was going to hit him with a slingshot. He has speed because he's not wearing any armor. He can move around. He can run up to Goliath, and he can stay far away from him so that Goliath can't touch him. And as we're about to learn in a little bit, Goliath couldn't even see him. And so he swung it around and shot it right at his forehead, the same way that we'd shoot someone. So the science behind slinging is this. Ethan Hurst, a ballistics expert with the Israeli Defense Forces, did a series of calculations showing the typical size stone hurled by an expert slinger at a distance of 35 meters would have hit Goliath's head at the velocity of 34 meters a second, enough to penetrate his skull. So this wasn't just hitting him in the head, it was actually penetrating his skull. We find David could have slung and hit Goliath in a little more than 1 second. So within 1 second of the battle starting, he's already hit Goliath, and Goliath would have just been standing there. He has all this heavy armor, he can't move. And then the other things, we often think about Goliath's advantage in this being that Goliath is big, but what we don't often think about is why Goliath was so big. So Goliath was 6'9". How many people are walking around that are that tall that we know? Not very many people are that tall. Goliath had acromegalia. So he had a tumor on his pituitary gland. Your pituitary gland controls hormones, just like the growth hormone being one of them. So that because he had this tumor, his body was constantly flooding his brain was constantly flooding his body with growth hormone. So he just never stopped growing. But because he had this tumor on his pituitary gland, it was suppressing his optic nerve to where Goliath couldn't see very well. And so when he says to David, "Come to me," the reason Goliath did hand-to-hand combat, besides the fact he was so big, is he couldn't see very far away. And in fact, the reason that someone was carrying his shield was because his army had this guy walk around everywhere with him with a shield, not because he was this great warrior, but because he couldn't really see so his strength in this was actually his weakness. It's what made him fail. So what is the conclusion of this story? And what is the point of this? Goliath had as much chance against David as any person with a sword would have against an opponent with a .45 automatic pistol. So David, when we think about David, we think of him as this little guy. He brought a gun to a sword fight. And so when I say his weakness, what we often think of his weakness, him being small, was his strength. If David had been a big guy, he would have been trained in hand-to-hand combat. That would have been his job. And he would have gone up to Goliath. He would have got up close with him, tons of armor, a sword, and he would have lost because he was way smaller than Goliath. Even if he had been bigger, he was never going to be as big as Goliath because Goliath had a tumor on his pituitary gland. But because he was so small, he was a shepherd. That's all he was, and we think of that as, a shepherd could never be a good fighter. But because of that, he had a gun. He had a gun, and Goliath had a sword. So I think this is a really good lesson for everything that we do in our lives. Things in life that happen to us, the hard, bad things that happen to us, we often think of them as weaknesses. Kids that have dyslexia, we think of that as a weakness. People who go through a lot in their lives and have traumatic childhoods, these things oftentimes actually end up being the thing that makes us able to be better. We think of them as our weaknesses, but they're actually our strengths. And the people who we think a lot of the time are big, like Goliath, they've had these easy lives, they come from money, all these things, they oftentimes are weakened by that. We look at them as these big figures, and they're not. And so I think a really important lesson for us to all take away from this and everything else in our lives is that the things that we think are hard actually make us better. Hard and bad are not the same thing. Thank you.